Well, thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to be partnering with Virginia Commonwealth University and several other universities across the country on this important work of elevating employment outcomes for transition age youth with disabilities. And we're excited to share a bit about our project today, as well as some of the early findings. We know that the pathways to employment are often forged for young people in those high school years, and the experiences that they have while they're still in high school often end up shaping the trajectories that they have in the years afterwards. So our focus is on young people with significant disabilities, students with labels of intellectual disability, autism, or multiple disabilities. And we're particularly looking at the effects of paid work in high school on the employment outcomes of youth with severe disabilities. And I'm joined by my colleagues from Vanderbilt University, Jessica Awesome, Michelle Schutz, Ben Schwartzman, and Leah Burgess. And so I want to begin the conversation where we always should begin the conversation, which is with the aspirations of youth with disabilities. That's where we ought to always begin. What is it that high school students with disabilities are saying they want for their early adult outcomes? And if you ask high school students with intellectual disability or autism or other developmental disabilities, you find that the vast majority say they expect to work in the years after high school. The data that you see on your screen comes from the National Longitudinal Transition Study 2012. They found that 95% of high school youth with high school students with disabilities expected to be working for pay in the years that followed graduation. But when we track students over time, we find that so many of those aspirations don't often materialize. Only 17% of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities ultimately obtain work in those years after school. So it's this gap between what people say they want and the outcomes they experience that we're really trying to tackle in this project, and the other sites that are part of this larger RRTC are also trying to tackle. So adolescence is really a critical time to focus on employment preparation. And we know from research and just our own experiences as teenagers growing up, the power of those early work experiences. The research tells us that having a paid job at some point before students with significant disabilities graduate ends up doubling or even tripling the odds of them having integrated employment in the early years after graduation. If you find a good job, it raises youth aspirations. They come to expect work and to pursue work. A good job during high school demonstrates students' capacity to work and gives them resume building experiences. They've got actual experiences that can prove to employers that they're hireable and that they can do good work on those jobs. But also those experiences shape the expectations of people around them. If students are working during high school, parents come to expect it. Teachers come to expect it, and then we start to aim services and supports to make sure that happens. Students get better actual references from real employers, and you can teach things in a job site you simply can't teach in a classroom, things you can't simulate. And those relationships and connections to employers may be the ticket to jobs that maintain or begin after graduation as well. So this is considered a best practice in transition. We've talked about this for a long time, and it aligns so much with the purpose of special education to prepare students with disabilities for the world of work. But we struggle to make this happen in widespread ways. And even though we know this is an important task, we wanted to focus on understanding how we make this happen and the long-term impact of these paid work experiences down the road. So let me share just a little bit about our overall project before we get into one of the early phases. Our multi-year project, like others, is focused on developing and refining a school-based supported employment intervention package that connects high school students with severe disabilities to paid employment. We also then want to evaluate the impact of that early paid work experience on later post-school outcomes. We're going to do that within a randomized control trial. And then we also, in that process, want to learn more about the pathways that students take into the workplace before and after graduation that makes this actually possible. So how much of that is a windy path versus a straight path? And what happens to those students after the school bus stops coming and employment's not yet in place? How does that path to employment take place? And at the end of the project, we want to be able to package all that we've learned, the intervention material, so that any school anywhere would be able to implement it with their students. So that's a bit of an overview of the project. And here's an overall timeline. We've got multiple phases. In the current phase that we're going to talk about today, we conducted focus groups with a number of key stakeholders and reviewed the relevant literature in the area of early employment experiences. That really encapsulated our prior year. We're presently sort of have been in phase 2 of this project, where we've been developing all of our measures and materials and intervention materials and finalizing them and preparing them for phase 3, which has been at a pilot intervention, which we're underway right now. We originally hoped to be doing our large randomized control trial this current year, but COVID led us to push it back 1 year and pilot with just a couple students. And so when you look ahead a year from now and 2 years from now, we'll hope to have phase 4 and phase 5 findings available, where we'll know what happens when we implement this intervention that connects students to early work experiences with a randomly assigned group of 45 students who get the intervention, 45 who don't, and then we'll package our findings and share it. So this is our overarching timeline, but we're going to actually focus the rest of our time on these earlier phases and share a bit about what we've been learning when we've talked with key stakeholders about the things that facilitate and stand in the way of early work experiences. So I'm going to pass it over to Jessica.
Yes, thank you, Eric. So sort of with what Eric was just discussing in mind, we started to think about what should our research questions be as we're going into these focus groups that are really going to be used to form our intervention package. So what we thought about was, well, we know that there's a lot of barriers. We hear a lot about the barriers, but we really wanted to understand the comprehensive list of barriers that people in the communities that we are trying to serve are actually experiencing. So our first research question is, what are the barriers to paid work during high school? And the second one is to actually ask about the solutions. We want to know the barriers, but we have to also know and understand what those solutions could look like. So our second question is, what is needed to facilitate access to paid work during high school? And then we really wanted to understand how stakeholders actually conceptualize meaningful work during high school for students with severe disabilities. So in terms of our participants, we were able to recruit 74 folks to participate in our focus group interviews. So we had 24 parents of young people with severe disabilities. We had 17 folks from employment agencies. So that includes pre-EDS providers, but also vocational rehabilitation staff, and then other agencies that serve adults with disabilities. We had 15 special educators and 13 employers, some of whom actually hired people with disabilities and some who have not. And then we have 5 school district leaders. So just there's a couple facts about the districts that we're going to be working with. We have 3 different districts as of now. One is an urban district, one is a suburban district, and one is a largely rural district that also is suburban as well. So for the urban district, our largest district is about 85,000 students and has 40% African American students, 28% Hispanic students, and 27% white students. So definitely our most diverse district. Then there are about 13% of students with disabilities that are enrolled at this school. This is something that you'll see is common across our districts, or pretty similar at least. And then about 38% of our students were economically disadvantaged or on free or reduced lunches within the urban district. Now, the suburban district is quite a different picture, being about half of the students, so about 40,000 students in our suburban district. And you can see 80% white, so very different, much less diversity within this district. 10% students with disabilities, and only 3% of their students are economically disadvantaged. And then our last district, our rural suburban district, had the least number of students, about 30,000, and 75% of those students were white, with 13% being African American and 9% being Hispanic. They actually had the largest percentage of students with disabilities, but only by a little bit, so 14%, and they're hovering around about 20% in terms of their students that would be on that free or reduced lunch. So for our interview procedures, we really thought that talking about, if we really wanted this comprehensive list of barriers and facilitators, which is what we'll be focusing on today, that a focus group is really the best way to do this to allow our stakeholders to build off of each other. So we started with focus groups. We were able to do 16 of those. We did have to switch to Zoom as the pandemic began. So just to respect our teachers' time and needs during this transition to virtual learning, we did do 8 of the interviews as individual. And then, we really focused around 3 topics when talking to our participants. So we started by making sure that the lens on this was students with severe disabilities. And then we focused on their views of the importance of employment. And that's really where those meaningful work questions came in. We asked them about barriers and facilitators to work. And then we presented them with an initial proposed intervention model that we developed. And we asked them for their recommendations about where we maybe had gaps or we had pieces that were unnecessary. So we really wanted to make sure that that intervention model was representing what was needed for these students. And our data analysis took a team approach. But so we first started by transcribing verbatim, checking each of the interviews, and then making sure they were all de-identified. Our team-based coding process was with all the staff that is on this webcast today, but we all have different transition expertise, which is why we are all part of this coding process. We also analyze this data across both focus group and individual interviews, but also by each of the different stakeholder groups. And then we used a constant comparative approach. So what that really means is that we started by soft coding our data. So we started by going through each of the interviews and creating an initial list of barriers and facilitators to create working code books. We came together as a team to come to consensus to make sure that those code books are what we wanted them to be as our initial working code book. And then we split into 2 pairs to begin analyzing each of the different interviews. And in those pairs, we came to consensus to make sure that each of the codes that were being updated as we were going in the code books, that everyone agreed upon that. And we had weekly meetings where we were able to update each other on everything that we were analyzing and making sure everyone, of course, came to consensus on that process. So as that was completed, we were then able to upload all of our final work into Deduce to manage our data and organize it. So with that in mind, I will hand this over to Ben to begin to discuss some of our barriers.
Great, thanks, Jessica. And as Jessica mentioned, our first research question we were aiming to answer centered around what barriers affect the ability of high school students with IDD to attain paid employment while still in high school. And again, our goal was to make sure that our intervention properly addressed the most substantial barriers identified by our focus groups. Our qualitative data fell into these 8 themes of barriers: student-related challenges, which were barriers related to students' skills and abilities; family-related challenges, which were barriers that related to the family's ability to support their child in attaining employment; school-related challenges, which were barriers that related to school staff and the school system's ability to support students in paid employment; service system challenges related to barriers impacting outside of school support services, such as vocational rehabilitation or pre-employment transition services; workplace-related challenges consisted of barriers from employers and businesses; partnership challenges were barriers that related to difficulties in partnerships and communication between the previously mentioned groups of stakeholders; and community-related challenges were barriers in specific communities that made it difficult to find jobs; and transition challenges related to difficulties accessing reliable transportation to and from work. Themes were then further coded and broken down to more detailed barriers. So additionally, each barrier was then coded based on which groups mentioned each barrier, as indicated in this table. And the color of boxes indicates the level of emphasis each group put on particular barriers, with white boxes indicating barriers that were not mentioned by particular groups, and darker shades of blue indicating more emphasis. So for example, as you can see in the table, soft skill difficulties and student-related challenges was a barrier that was mentioned by all 5 groups, with educator, employer, and parent focus groups putting the most emphasis on soft skills as being a substantial barrier to employment. Other student-related challenges that came up in the focus groups included challenges related to student behavior and mental health, challenges related to communication, difficulties with executive functioning, students not being able to meet specific job requirements, lack of motivation to get a job, difficulties related to physical abilities such as motor skills or movement, and challenges related to being safe on the job. Educators put the most emphasis on family-related challenges affecting employment as compared to other stakeholder focus groups. Specific family-related challenges included difficulties in advocating for their child, concerns around their child losing benefits if employed, confusion around conservatorship and how that might impact paid work, families having too high or too low of expectations around work, families hindering their child's independence skills and growth, lack of family involvement, and then other personal family challenges such as mental health or financial difficulties and concerns about their child's safety on the job. And here are 2 sample quotes as examples of how particular statements were coded from our focus groups. This particular quote from an agency focus group was coded as a student-related challenge due to lack of motivation. Sometimes the unwillingness in some participants to not try new things and to do tasks that maybe they're not ready for or comfortable with. And this second quote from an educator focus group was coded as a family-related challenge due to their concerns about losing benefits. I have had a couple of times where we have said, your child is so capable of finding a job. I would love to help him apply to Walmart and we can practice interview skills. And the parent said no, because if you work so many hours, you can lose your Social Security benefit. I have not heard of any of our students working that many. I can't remember exactly how many hours per week, but it's close to a full-time job. The school-related challenges were coded as follows. Difficulties experienced by teachers in their efforts to give enough focus to both academics and employment, teachers and school staff having low expectations of their students, being unfamiliar with what's available in the community, lack of funding, difficulties related to school infrastructure, lack of knowledge of best practices, lack of assessing students' vocational skills, confusion around school policies, lack of staffing to support students in finding employment, special education students not being included in career and technical education classes, lack of training for school staff around employment, and not providing work-based learning opportunities for students. Lack of staffing was identified by each stakeholder group as impacting students' abilities to attain paid employment. Service system challenges included confusion around navigating adult services, lack of funding to provide appropriate supports, halting of services after high school, often referred to as the service cliff, and challenges related to sharing information with stakeholders about the services agencies provide, difficulties around planning pre-ETs, challenges caused by service system policies, and staffing related difficulties such as turnover or lack of staff. And here's a quote that describes school-related staffing challenges, which was shared in an educator focus group. I have about 8 kids that go out for work-based learning, but because I'm the only one in the building that's trained, only me and my para are the ones that can go. So it's not like I can have kids go to different sites. I have to find one site and all of us go. The second quote, which was shared in an educator focus group, describes the service system challenge of halting of services as students transition from high school to the adult service system. The biggest thing that we found is that we teach them all these work skills, we build them up, we get them that employment when they're with us, and they even get job offer opportunities for after they leave us. But once they've left us, it just kind of goes all downhill and they just kind of go back to just living at home, just doing their chores at home or whatever it is. Of the barriers coded under employer and workplace challenges, each stakeholder group identified employers' unwillingness to provide paid employment and employers' concerns about liability as barriers impacting paid employment. Other barriers related to the employer and workplace included challenges related to accessibility and receiving needed accommodations, lack of availability of job coaching supports, lack of job opportunities for individuals with IDD, lack of availability of natural on-the-job supports, difficulties related to employer budgets and finances, and employers' lack of understanding of disability and working with people with disabilities. Partnership challenges included lack of communication between other stakeholder groups and families, lack of collaboration between agencies and different service providers, and lack of collaboration with local schools and school districts. Community challenges included lack of jobs available in particular communities and lack of community members' awareness and understanding of people with disabilities. Transportation challenges included difficulties around families providing transportation and access to reliable and accessible transportation. School collaboration and transportation access were barriers that were identified by each stakeholder group. This first quote is an example of a workplace liability challenge mentioned in an employer focus group. How do you navigate having a job coach in the workplace and properly insuring them? And the second quote from an agency focus group describes a partnership related barrier involving school collaboration. I have one school, there's 8 special ed teachers with classrooms, and one of our agencies that's in there is only allowed in 2 classrooms with 2 of the teachers and maybe has a total of 14 students with both classes combined, when there's several more students that could benefit from the service. And just a couple additional quotes, one on community challenges. The community is fearful when it comes to dealing with students with disabilities because, first of all, they feel that they're fragile. They feel that they don't understand or cannot do the job. They feel that they're going to slow them down. The community is generally not patient. And then a quote around transportation challenges from an agency group. Transportation, you either have it or you don't. And with our agency, some do and some don't. The lack of transportation is a justifiable reason to close the case for employment services. And I'll now turn things over to Michelle, who will be describing the solutions to these barriers that our stakeholder groups came up with.
Thanks, Ben. So on the flip side, our second research question addressed all of the things needed to facilitate paid work or make it happen for students with disabilities. So similar to with barriers, these facilitators encompassed a wide spectrum of items, as you can see here. So we coded individual facilitators to employment and then categorized them into these 9 themes. So I'll now take some time to illustrate the extent to which each of these facilitators were mentioned across each of our stakeholder groups. So our first 3 facilitators that you see on the top of the screen relate to items that students need in order to access paid work, such as strong instruction, work experiences, and supports. So as you can see here, many stakeholders discuss the need particularly for career planning and employment instruction. Educators and employers specifically spoke heavily of the necessity of teaching collateral skills or additional skills that would be needed to obtain and maintain employment for students. And then community-based work was mentioned extensively across all 5 stakeholder groups. The most prominently discussed student supports were access to natural supports and quality job coaches who could assist students while working on the job. And then finally, educators and district leaders emphasized the importance of dedicated staff who are provided with support from their school districts to facilitate paid employment for their students. So to dive a bit more deeply into the words of participants regarding these first section of facilitators, we'll now look at a few quotes. So in this first quote, you can see a parent stresses the importance of teaching youth job-specific skills, saying, "I think that's why I kind of keep going back to these job skills. I think to be most successful, I would want my child to have done whatever she's going to be asked to do in that job in some other format." And then in the second quote, also from a parent, the participant discusses the importance of community-based work experiences, which again, as I mentioned previously, was described most frequently across all 5 stakeholder groups. So they said, I think it's very important to get a chance before they're excused from school to have as much exposure as they can with hands-on work. Finding things that they are good at, they enjoy, kind of point them in the right direction. Give them a couple ideas. I know that once they're finished, then some other programs can kick in and give them some help and a little bit of career guidance and things like that. But I think that it's a great first step if you have something kind of in mind of what their interests may be. And then these additional 2 quotes speak to the importance of youth having access to quality job coaches who can provide sufficient support, but as you'll see in this first quote, scaffolded support rather than too much support. So an educator said, I feel even when our students do get paid employment, they still need that person to go in and help them for a few weeks, a few months, a few days, whatever it may be. Teach them and make sure that they have ways and have the skills to stand up for what they need at work. And they know what's expected of them, and then back off and let them do their thing. And then additionally, this employer discussed the importance of having access to a dedicated staff member with whom they could check in regarding the student that was working at their workplace. So they said, I think it might be helpful to have someone the employer can check in with that might be more of an expert on the specific disability that the student has, to make sure that if something's not going right, they can talk to that person about, hey, this is what I'm seeing. And then they could be like, well, maybe this is a manifestation of their disability, someone that can work with the employer on how the student learns and works best. So in these next set of barriers, all stakeholders discussed the importance of individualization when it came to creating jobs for students, assessing their skills, and then having person-centered planning. Parents focused particularly on individualized assessments and job opportunities, while educators concentrated on aligning jobs to students' preferences, interests, needs, and strengths. And then additionally, as you can see, several facilitators emerged related to having the right attitudes and mindsets for students to become employed. And this regarded not only student mindsets, but also the attitudes of their families, of educators, and of the surrounding community of employers and others. Educators focused heavily on the need to destigmatize disability and focus primarily on student strengths, as well as being able to motivate employers to hire their students and then motivate their students to want to go to work. And parents discussed their own need to have high expectations, which was interesting. Lastly, stakeholders discussed the need for training and information for a whole host of individuals, including businesses, families, educators, and providers. So here are a few quotes that illustrate these particular facilitators. So first, a district leader discussed the importance of a job being the correct fit for a student in order for them to keep that job after they graduated. So they said, I think that job development piece too, of finding the right fit for the student and helping them really understand what their options are, is important in maintaining that year of employment after finishing high school. And then additionally, a provider mentioned the importance of family involvement in making this happen as well. So they said the student might hang in there for a year, but if he got someone in the family that are saying, I really want you to get to work, having that family involvement is, I think, a key piece. And then moreover, in this quote, an employer illustrates a strong desire for some sort of intake process that would be led by the school or the provider that would allow for the employer to fully understand what's expected of them in employing the student. So they said, I would say that there needs to be some kind of intake process, resource guide, so employers kind of know upfront what's expected of them. Also, so that the employers can be held accountable and students can hold those employers accountable to them in making sure that they take care of their accommodations. And then in this last section of facilitators, stakeholders discussed the importance of collaboration, and this involved several different parties, including businesses, families, providers, schools, and the outside community. Or more specifically, as you can see, they specifically named marketing students to employers in order to encourage them to hire them as a facilitator, along with communication that needs to occur between employers and students. And then finally, they talked about utilizing current collaborations that they already were a part of, but maybe doing so in new ways to connect students to work. So of these, collaborating with businesses and agencies were discussed most frequently across stakeholder groups. And then lastly, while not discussed as frequently or as in depth as other facilitators, transportation was brought up across every single stakeholder group as something that was needed for students to connect to paid employment. So if we take a look at some final quotes here from stakeholder groups, an educator discussed the importance of providers collaborating more closely with families rather than always going indirectly through the school. And that participant said, I think the more that these agencies can actually come and sit down and talk to parents, it's going to be better, to give them the opportunity to really go out and see what they're doing. And then lastly, this parent discussed the necessity for transportation that was essential for getting youth to work, particularly for families who work themselves and have other responsibilities that may keep them from being available to drive youth to work themselves. So that parent said, well, I mean, for me, it's all also the transportation and training and planning. You know, I have a very flexible schedule. Right now, I'm not working, but that could be an issue, obviously, for for people whose parents have jobs and stuff like that. So I'll now turn it over to Jessica to talk about the discussions and implications of these focus groups.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Yes, so as you just heard, we asked for a comprehensive list of barriers and we definitely received them. But our participants really brought up a number of different concerns and actual challenges that they have experienced in helping students become employed and doing so successfully and engaging in paid employment specifically. We also were very happy to see that while we did have a lot of focus on barriers, participants were also very willing and happy to come up with solutions to these barriers. And I think, as you all just also heard, that many of those barriers or those facilitators that they came up with were really realistic solutions to some of the problems that we have experienced. And for us, something that is very important is that we were able to not only take those barriers and facilitators that were raised, but also the feedback that we were given on our initial intervention model and really hone this model to fit for the needs of students with disabilities. And with that in mind, it's really a big implication of this research is that we're actually able to take these findings and translate them into an intervention model that's going to be implemented with students and their school teams. So that's something that we're really excited about resulting from this. But I want to talk a little bit about what the findings can tell us for the future. So the first is really that we need to make sure we're collaborating and collaborating better to actually serve our students with severe disabilities. And that means that everyone must know their role in this process. And that even comes down to something as simple as who do you contact and how do you contact them? So those are the first two pieces that we're really seeing come out of these focus groups. The third thing it combines a number of different things, but is first that students need work preparation. We know that. We know that students need to have job skills in order to enter the job market, but we need to make sure that that work preparation is appropriate and individualized to the needs of our students. The next piece of that is that we need to be giving students opportunities to actually to try out these skills that they are learning. And that needs to be done in two ways. It's really important that students are able to try that in controlled classroom environments. It helps them gain familiarity, it makes them feel safe, but we also need them going out and having real world experiences in the community. So that's why we really encourage, and our participants are encouraging, volunteer positions, internships, and ultimately paid employment. But all of these things also need to be addressed, including staffing. We have to have more staff to do this work. That was discussed over and over again with our participants. But it also means that those staff have to be sufficiently trained and resourced so that they can do this work. And it doesn't only include the staff, it also includes their school employment team. So their family, their related service providers, their outside agency personnel. And the last piece is to address this attitudes piece. So we need to elevate expectations around what students with severe disabilities can do. We need to make sure that paid employment becomes the rule rather than the exception, so that everyone can understand in general that students with disabilities, students with severe disabilities can work and they want to work. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Leah to tell you a little bit about our finalized intervention model and our next steps.
Thank you, Jessica. As Eric mentioned, we are now in phase 3, piloting the initial intervention approach during COVID. These data that Ben and Michelle presented have been used to inform our intervention, which includes various practice and approaches that schools will implement with our coaching and support. Our final model of the intervention is broken down into 3 different categories: pre-employment planning, supporting the students in employment, and transitioning out of high school. The pre-employment planning will focus on transition assessments and person-centered planning, building a support network, involving families, coordinating pre-employment transition services and vocational rehab services, benefits counseling, and job development. Concerns around benefits were mentioned as a factor that prevents students from engaging in paid employment. We want to connect families to benefits counseling, as this was mentioned as a solution to facilitate paid work experiences. Next, we plan to support students while they are employed through community work experiences, job readiness training, planning and training around transportation, and on-the-job supports. Having access to job coaches or supports at the workplace was mentioned as a key factor in facilitating paid work. Finally, we will provide follow-up support as youth transition out of high school by conducting an exit assessment, establishing transition supports, and checking in to track progress after graduation. A barrier that was presented during our focus groups was students leaving high school and not being connected to adult services. The solution was establishing those adult services before the student exited high school. Our overall goal is to have students participate in at least 100 hours of paid integrated work that will lead to continued paid employment in the community after high school. We are currently piloting our intervention with 2 students from our partner districts. We have held the employment planning meeting and are working on job development to connect students to paid employment in the community. Our next step will be scheduling the exit meeting to coordinate adult services from the support network that we built during the employment planning meeting. This will help facilitate the transition out of high school. Phase 3 will be followed by rigorous evaluation and later disseminating in phases 4 and 5. And again, I want to echo the thank yous that Eric opened with and appreciate everyone attending today. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to visit our website, transition.vcurrtc.org, and we would be happy to discuss further. Thank you.